Nebraska, Nebraska Business Development Center at the University of Nebraska Omaha, to poll both the Omaha and Lincoln metropolitan areas. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the survey methodology just to kind of get that out of the way, because I know that's not why most of you are here. But we mailed the survey out in April and May of last year, so that's an important context. Where we were a year ago might feel like 20 years ago in COVID years, but it was just a year ago. And then so for the rural poll, we sent out about 6,000. For both polls, we sent out about 6,000. We got about a 20 to 25% response rate from both of those polls. And then we have a margin of error about 2% on the rural poll and then 3% on the metro poll. Just how we mail it out, we do several mailings to make sure that we get responses following kind of typical mail survey protocols. So our response rate has decreased, like almost all survey response rates have decreased over the last several years, but we're still pretty confident with the data that we get from our respondents. How we break up the state of Nebraska is also, I think, interesting. So we've got in green, we've got the metropolitan areas. So Seward and Lancaster make up the Lincoln metro area. And then the 5 counties, Saunders, Cass, Sarpy, Douglas, make up the Omaha metro area. We actually have 2 other metro areas in Nebraska. Dixon and Dakota are part of the Sioux City area, metro area. And then Hall, Howard, Merrick, and Hamilton are part of the Grand Island metro area. Grand Island actually switched to a metropolitan area in about 2013. But because the rural poll has been going since 1996, we've included them in the rural poll portion because of the ability to compare results across years. And then Dixon and Dakota, we've included in the rural poll, given the more rural nature of those counties, specifically in comparison to the Lincoln and Omaha metro areas within Nebraska specifically. So when I talk about the metro polls in this presentation, I'm really talking about Lincoln and Omaha metro areas. And then when I'm talking about rural, I'm talking about the rest of the state. And then just a little bit about our data. So on the left-hand side, you see the rural poll. And so we use the American Community Survey as a benchmark for our sample. And so, and then on the right is the metro. What you'll see is that our demographics skew a little bit more educated, a little bit higher income, and more married than never married. And so those are factors to consider as you're processing this data. Again, we're still confident. We still have those confidence intervals of about 2 or 3% on each of our polls. So yeah. So why focus on trust and confidence? Every year, we have a set of core questions within the poll that we ask, and then we choose topics based on things that are going on. And so last year, we were thinking a lot about trust and confidence in institutions. That comes up probably every election year. And so we kind of work on these for about 6 months as we're kind of coming up with the potential questions and vet them down. And then also, I think COVID also influenced us a lot in the trust in information sources around healthcare and health practices was something that was clearly part of what was going on in Nebraska this last year. So when I think about trust, I study it generally from an interpersonal perspective, so not so much in the institutional perspective, but in the context of interpersonal trust, I think about a little bit about like bike air or air in your bike tires. If you don't have enough air, you work a lot harder to move. And actually you can cause a lot of damage to your bike or to yourself if you don't have your tires pumped up. And that's similar with trust. And if organizations don't have trust, it takes them a lot more effort and work to convince and influence people to get something done. And so it's another way to think about it is when you think about the kind of when you see someone doing something and someone you trust, you perceive that completely differently than someone you don't. And same with organizations. If you trust an organization, your response to what they're telling you is completely different than if it's an organization you don't trust. And so trust is kind of an important part of how we get things done in any kind of collective action. So I'll dig in a little bit to some of the data that I thought was pretty interesting. And so this is the Metro and Rural Trust and Health Organizations to provide reliable information on COVID. And so the green arrows indicate where there are differences between metro and rural audiences or participants. And so we saw that folks from the metro areas were more likely to trust information from their own doctor or healthcare professional, CDC, local health department, World Health Organization, state public health officials, and local government officials. And then there was pretty even for both metro and rural. So when I look at this data, it makes me first think that in the rural areas, there was a lot less trust and just information about COVID overall. And that there was more trust in metro areas about information in general. But if you look at probably the one that is most striking is the 26-point differential for CDC, which is intended, as far as I understand. I'm not a CDC expert, but it's definitely intended to be an entity that gives evidence-based information out to the public and to make policy recommendations based on that evidence. Whether they actually engage in the policy making is not quite clear to me, but it's clear that they're evidence-based practices and they're trying to give information out, and there's a lot of mistrust there. So that was one of the things that came up. And as I'm going through, please feel free to ask questions, post them in the chat, or unmute. I'm happy to address those. One of the other questions we asked specifically was comparing metro and rural areas, which entity should be the primary authority for public health decisions during a public health emergency. So when we think about mask mandates or things like that, who should be making those choices? And so there weren't a lot of differences between metro and rural respondents on this specific question. We see a little bit more with local health departments. One of the pieces that seems consistent is that local and state government, so government entities are seen as less prioritized, or are people are thinking they shouldn't have the authority to be making those decisions. More so the health departments or the healthcare professionals, public health officials. So that was an interesting finding here in my mind about the difference in who do people want making decisions. Doesn't look like people trust our government to make these kinds of decisions, which makes sense in my mind. It's a political decision versus a public health safety decision. So regionally, I thought there were some interesting regional differences as well. Which entity should be the primary authority for public health decisions? So we see from the rural poll some differences in who should be making those decisions. A trend I notice is just the farther west you go across the state, the more local control I think is desired. And I mean, that I think makes sense given just the geographic proximity to the state capital, to the rest of the state. And then on the right side, what I thought was interesting, so remember this is 2001, April and May. And so there were differences in how Omaha and Lincoln were managing specifically mask mandates at that time. And so we see a difference in local health departments making decisions. And so at the time, there was a mask mandate in Lincoln. And so you see, 49% of the respondents agreed with local health department making those decisions. So to the degree to which everyone knew that the local health department was making that decision, I'm not sure, but it would seem to me that this is somewhat of a referendum on some of those policy decisions that were made. I'm sure I'm overstating. Becky's probably getting nervous about what I'm going to say, but I think it's kind of a fair guess. I'll call it. So, and we can go through these at the end, but as I kind of wrap up, I got 3 different sections. I thought I would just throw out a couple of questions to ponder and kind of spark interest for discussion later. But I'm wondering if your own experience, I saw we've got a number of folks who work in public health areas. So I wonder what thoughts there might be about any changes that might have occurred in the last year in some of these ideas, because remember, the data that's about a year old. And this is something that we rarely get to explore in the rural poll or our metro poll, is what are the factors that influence these differences. We see some differences between metro and urban, or metro and rural, but not necessarily sure what drives those differences. And then, I know we've got a lot of experts today, so I'm wondering, what implications do you see from this data based on this information? So, like I said, I'm throwing out those questions, and feel free to ponder them as we work our way through, and then we'll have some time for discussion at the end. So the next set of questions I had were about confidence in institutions. And so what we see here are some different institutions and metro and rural differences in confidence in those institutions. And so we see quite a few similarities, more similarities than differences. And so a couple of places where we see differences in the metro respondents tended to have more confidence in voting and election systems at the county level. So there was more trust in local voting, and also that voting systems across the country. There was more trust in metro respondents for that. You see quite a shift in rural respondents in their trust in voting between local and national voting systems. And so the other place where we see a difference is presidency and the executive branch. So metro folks tend to have more, respondents have tended to have more confidence in the presidency and executive branch. And I think some of that data is probably driven, at least in part, by the political affiliation and the presidential change, political party change between 2017 and 2021. So the political party shift, and just the nature of having generally more Republicans in the rural parts of the state proportionally than we do in other parts of Nebraska and the metro areas. And then trust in the U.S. Supreme Court also was lower for rural respondents than metro respondents. Again, you'll see here that there tends to be more trust in institutions that are closer to home, and less trust in institutions that are farther away from home. That's kind of a general trend that we see basically every year whenever we ask questions, almost about anything in the rural poll. Things that tend to be closer to home, people have a little bit more trust in than they do farther away from home. And one of the things that we were able to do in 2021 was look at specific differences between 2017 and 2021 respondents. And so we only were able to do this comparison for rural respondents, because in 2017 we only collected data in the rural portion of the state. But what we see are an increase in public safety between in 2021 compared to 2017. And then we also see a decrease in trust in the presidency. Again, that second one I might attribute to shifting political parties in office. So that would make sense to me. The public safety agencies one is less clear to me as to what might have caused that shift or why that shift occurred. And then we see a lot of similarities across the other areas. I mean, overall, kind of lower trust than higher trust in institutions overall. So for these ones, I'm also interested in any thoughts folks might have about factors influencing the difference between the rural and metro respondents. Any kind of implications you could identify from the specific data that's provided, and any trends that you find interesting or intriguing. As someone who's interested in data, I find so many things just interesting, and I have, every time I look at the rural poll, I have about 50 more questions I want to ask. Unfortunately, we only have 14 pages. Well, I guess it depends on who you ask. We're limited in how many pages we can send out and that people will actually respond to. If it were up to, I think, everyone on the team, there would be like an 80-page book, but Becky keeps us in line for that, which we appreciate.
LJ, is it all right if we just pause right now to field some of those questions? I think there's a lot of data, and so before we move on to trust and information sources, I think we're doing pretty good on time. So let's take a few minutes. Does anybody have any questions either about the public health decisions, public health emergency, trust in those institutions, or the institutions that we just covered?
I actually had a question on the public safety agencies and community. Would that be like rural fire departments? I mean, do you like have a sense of what all would be included in that?
Yeah, I think it would be rural fire departments, I think police departments, I think emergency response in general would be included in that. Obviously, we don't know specifically because we ask it this way, but those tend to be how people categorize those in some of our other questions. I mean, I would imagine public safety probably would have included public health responses, given the nature of how given that this happened in 2021, the survey was provided in 2021. I think probably more people would have affiliated public safety with public health, given COVID. 2017, that would have been less likely, I'm assuming. But again, those are just kind of guesses based on the context of when the questions were asked.
I have a question. This is Eric with Appleseed. Your scale talks about the percent answering a great deal. Can you describe why you use that measure instead of like all the positive versus all the negative, or something like that?
Yeah, we have all of that on the in the data. This is one of the ways that we've just decided to do comparisons. It provides a little bit of it's a little bit harder to break down all of the different answering responses. So it's kind of just a choice for displaying information. And I would say the opposite end would have been like the no trust at all. And maybe I think as a more positively oriented group, we're interested in the more positively oriented kind of framing for these. So I think that's part of our bias as researchers too, as the group of researchers we're focused, but all of the data is available to provide kind of clarity around all of the different response options, which would have been no trust at all to a great deal. And if I remember correctly, it was a 5-point scale. Any other questions?
Hey, LJ, this is Tom Bliss with Southeast Nebraska Development District. I'm curious, did you take a look at how local economies were performing? Because I noticed that as it went west, distrust in local institutions decreased. But here in Southeast Nebraska, you talk to local economic developers, and routinely they would say that their local economies are doing great. Sales taxes expectations were beyond what they had hoped for. I'm just kind of curious if that may have had an impact on that, as businesses may have shut down or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. We've not looked at that specifically. We don't kind of take in other economic data. We do have some folks who do that kind of research, who would look at that. Some of our folks who are in the ag econ department, but that would be kind of specialized questions or something that we would encourage people to do with our data if that was something of interest to them. But yeah, there's no doubt that the local economy would definitely influence how people are perceiving some of these questions. I'm trying to
Anybody
think.
else?
Yeah. And I'm trying to
LJ.
remember- yeah, I was going to say, I was trying to remember if we had a regional breakdown for some of these, and I can look that up when I get a chance, but there may be a more regional breakdown for some of these questions.
I did notice, I know you mentioned that you want to lean towards the positive, but my background's in community planning, and I work with some peers who are on the more hostile end of some criticism or thinking of people who want to contest how something was decided. And I noticed in the poll there was quite a bit of a shift of at least in the rural areas, of some of the people who had some confidence in an institution that seemed to shift to very little. And if that's a trend that you also took note of, seemed to be an outlier from previous polling years, or if that was in line with sort of the general arc, is that kind of been the trend for several years, or is that new?
It's not something that I've never necessarily picked up on specifically. I think one of the things that I think we're seeing a little bit more is more polarized responses in general. I haven't done any specific analysis to that end to check that specifically, but as I look through the data, I'm getting less and less surprised by the fact that our responses sometimes become more polarized as opposed to gravitating towards the middle, which is kind of the typical expectation for surveys. So that seems to be something that's occurring, and I'm getting less and less surprised by it.
Okay, well, thanks. I think we just had Cindy has set us up for the next session section, LJ. So I think we can move on to trust in media sources.
Absolutely, perfect. So I'm starting here off in trust in rural media sources or rural trusted media sources. And so you're going to see some similarities, and I'll go through this, the metro, and then I'll present some similarities between the two. So this is a much more detailed breakdown of the rural data specifically, and so we see rural Nebraskans tend to trust information from family, friends, and acquaintances, local news, including TV and newspapers, and then actually public sources, so both PBS and public radio would be more trusted sources of information. Folks in rural Nebraska are likely to have the least amount of trust in social networking sites, internet, blogs, and then MSNBC and CNN. And so we see, a pretty high level of trust, about 75%, with some or a lot of trust in friends and family and acquaintances. One of the questions that comes up for me in this is that to what degree are social networking sites and family, friends, and acquaintances? So as people think about this, like if their family or friends are posting to social media, is that a different level of trust than just social media in general? Because those are two categories with overlapping components to them. So obviously with this question, we're not able to figure that out, but that's a question I have and I'm thinking about a lot as to how do we, whether or not, like if your friend posts something or your family member posts something, are you less likely to trust it or more likely to trust it? I'm sure it depends on the family member. At least it would in my life, my family members. The other piece is there's a lot of distrust or a lack of trust in like CNN, MSNBC, social networking, and internet news blogging. So over 50% of the folks did not trust those specific sources of information, which you know, kind of when we think about how people consume information, you know, that's a lot of information that's being consumed that it apparently isn't trusted. So that's an interesting finding from the way people responded to that question. And then when we look at the metro area, again, we see friends, family, and acquaintances as being a trustworthy source of information. Local news sources, so TVs and newspapers. Public sources again, so PBS and public radio, and then state newspapers. And I mean, I think when we developed the questions, when we were thinking state newspapers, we were really thinking of Omaha World Herald and Lincoln Journal-Star as the primary state newspapers. So I'm not, I mean, when we made that question, that's what we had in mind, but I'm not sure if anyone else would consider other state newspapers. And then again, for the metro folks, they were less likely to trust social networking sites and internet news blogs. But on this list, Fox News ends up on the list of less likely to trust, or at least trusted. So in this case, only one of the news sources had a higher than 50% no trust response, and that was the social networking sites. So we see some similarities between the two groups. And then I broke this apart, or we looked at this in the metro and rural, and then we look at the specific differences. So even though PBS was trusted quite a bit by both metro and rural respondents, metro respondents were much more likely to rate it as having a lot of trust in that specific agency. And then folks in the rural areas were more likely to trust local newspapers. Local TV news was more likely to be trusted by metro area, as was public radio. We see a difference in Fox News for rural folks having more trust in that. And then the metro having more trust in a number of areas: national broadcast news, state newspapers, national newspapers, CNN, and MSNBC. We see, not a lot of trust in those four bottom categories: national radio talk programs, podcasts, social networking sites, and internet news blogs. So these trends for me are interesting. I mean, it's hard for me not to look at this from a political lens of seeing like what political parties are affiliated with different news agencies, and so tend to be more affiliated with news agencies, and so that the data kind of speaks to the fact that our news is somewhat siloed, and so which I don't think comes as a surprise to anyone, but this data just kind of reinforces that, which in one of the major implications as I think through this is that the news is no longer, and maybe it never has been, to be fair, but the news is consumed very differently by different folks, And so our sets of reality of what is happening in the world or what's happening around us is being provided to us via different streams of information. And so there's that shared reality is, or shared sense of what's happening in the world is not there, given the diversity of news, ways to consume news, and then also the way that people are choosing, or the way people have developed trust with specific sources of information versus others. So my questions here are, again, what are influencing factors between metro and rural respondents, implications that you might see, and then any trends that might intrigue or interest you. Those are kind of just general questions that I wanted to throw out. So we can come back to these questions, but I will just, this was my last slide of just resources that I thought were helpful if you're interested in trusted media. Rural Poll, Civic Health Index has a nice section on this. And then, Pew and Gallup also cover this quite a bit. And then internationally, OECD and the United Nations cover this topic quite a bit as well. So I'll open it up to any other questions, but I thought I'd provide those resources in case someone was interested.
And we will be able to send out a PDF of some of these slides. Isn't that right, LJ?
Yep.
Okay, great. So you should have those links afterwards. Okay, well, hopefully we have some questions. I did want to ask, well, feel free to ask any clarifying questions you have about the data. One of the things that we touched on a little bit, LJ, but I wanted to ask more specifically, is if there were any other significant differences that you were able to pull out by race, income. You touched on geography a little bit, but if you are able to pull out any of those differences, that any big patterns that emerged?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think. Age is one that almost always comes up as a potential breakdown. And then education, to speak to Dale, I'm not remembering anything specific about those right off the top of my head. I don't know, Becky, if you remember that specifically.
I'm not sure which piece of information Dale, you're most interested in. I was looking for example, for the Rural Poll, when we looked at trust in information sources, the slides he just went over, education there was some differences there. People with higher education were more likely than people with less education to trust PBS, their local TV news, national newspapers, state newspapers, and local news. So basically most newspapers, as well as PBS and local TV news, is where we saw some differences on the Rural Poll side. And I was going to look at confidence.
I was primarily interested in the education measurement from the standpoint that with comparable educations, does the rural change much to the metro? In other words, is that a determining indicator?
I don't think we've broken down the data across metro and rural in that way. It's a great question, but we haven't broken down the data that way.
Well, clearly we have news today that's delivered with bias at all different levels, really. I mean, people are identifying that it's at the national and regional and local, and sometimes I felt like if you understand how the bias works in delivering news, some people can see through it where others can't, and it's my curiosity.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think about like where, if you've ever been in a place where you kind of are stuck with whatever news channel is on, whether that's a doctor's office, an airport, I was in the Army, so whenever you went anywhere to eat, there was always news was always on. Anytime you had that, it was on whatever channel it was on, and so it's it's hard to remain vigilant, I think, constantly if that's what if you're thinking about the biases that exist within the news. It just becomes part of the ether, and you just kind of start absorbing it. So it's depending on how much access. Hopefully, you're not taking in that much news. For everyone's own personal health at this point. I can't imagine anyone would recommend more intake of news these days.
One of the other things I'll mention, we had a session in the fall with a group of journalists who mentioned sometimes their frustrations as local newspapers ownership becomes consolidated. They have less control over what gets posted on social media and what articles show up on their homepages. And so, so how headlines are worded and what stories even show up can influence confidence of the local population in those news sources, because those decisions are made outside of the area. So I know that was something that has come up as well.
Yeah, and well, when we think about consolidation more broadly for different kinds of organizations, you look at education too. That's a really hot topic where a school district consolidates and how people react to that. I remember going to a small community when I first moved to Nebraska and was talking about was working with kids in the schools and working with teachers, and the students were identifying that the school consolidation was a source of tension in the community. And I thought, well, interesting. That's really fascinating. This would have been about 2014. And I said, oh, how long ago did the school consolidation happen? And it was like 1972 or something like that. And I was like, holy man, yeah. So that continued distrust has just kind of continued in those small communities for a really long time. And the kids still felt it, 40 years later.
Thanks. I want to turn our questions to the audience. I'm curious if this is consistent with what you're seeing. What examples do you have from your work of these trends in action? And if you have any experiences that are counter to some of the trends that you're seeing maybe on the state level, how have you been experiencing these trends? What implications do you think trust in institutions and these media sources has in the work that you're doing?
I guess I'll bite. Hi, I'm Cindy Maxwell Ostick, and I've just have a lot of concern that it feels like in areas in Omaha, I've attended school board meetings and various other events, and there doesn't seem to be trust in anything. The science, there's no trust in science. There's no trust in, common set of facts. And I just don't know if, like, these numbers from 2021, like, if they're getting worse. It feels to me on a month-by-month basis that it just has become so divisive with, the mask mandates and vaccination and, what's happening in Lincoln and nationally. I just feel like there's such a disconnect. And I'm wondering if people on this call have suggestions about how everyday Nebraskans or people who are interested in working on trying to rebuild trust in our community, trust in each other, and in some of these issues.
Thank you. Does anybody have any suggestions? How have you been building trust in institutions in your region?
This is Dale again. Certainly, this is on the forefront of my mind, rebuilding trust, because I think it's key to us getting to a point where we can actually get things accomplished in our communities. But the observations that I've had lately, and this is probably because of the tension that we've had across Nebraska since 2019, from the bomb cyclone, 2 years of pandemic, and now volatility in markets, fuel prices, everything. We're just observing that people are triggered, even in small organization groups in our community. People seem to be triggered and just really sitting on the edge. I've just noticed more hostility. I wondered if anybody else is sensing that, and how can we go about, and maybe it's just going to take some time, but how can we go about relieving some of that tension? Anybody have any ideas?
I'll use the work of one of my colleagues who worked on a project kind of looking at what successful communities in Nebraska were doing, and how that they promoted more civic engagement within their communities. And one of the things that they found in their research was, when you had a group of people working together to create hope. And so, a small group of people who could get something accomplished started building momentum, as what specific activity was. It didn't necessarily matter, but that activity prompted hope that had the potential, didn't always happen, but had the potential to be kind of contagious. And so if a group of folks within the community were hopeful because they were able to accomplish something, it allowed people to set other goals to try to accomplish things together. That seemed to be a trend that existed in a number of the communities in which we were studying these kind of the success stories in Nebraska anyway.
Mhm.
I think that's interesting. I work for the public health department, and it's been an arduous 2 years of response of people that didn't even know our agency existed to seeing us as an authoritative entity then. And that's really, I think, what we're trying to traverse now, is what does that look like as far as how we continue to work so closely with the communities that we so dearly love and support and appreciate. We have done some different projects just in terms of active living and crosswalk beautification, just for the sheer sense of hope. So I thought that was interesting that you brought that up, and people they're still willing, they want to unite around something that can build energy around that, and we've had some, I think, some successes with that.
I want to mention another example as well. I was talking with a woman who helped open a grocery store in a small town of about 500 people. And she was feeling like the municipality, like the city government, didn't help out as much as they could have. I don't think there was a whole lot that she was really expecting from them to do of what they have available to help out, a private business. But just even showing support, being willing to help with communication, being proactive and making connections and relationships with people in the community would have meant a lot to her. And so that's something else, even if in our institutions, we can say, oh, well, that's not me, that's somebody else, that's out of my realm. Go talk to a different agency. Finding ways to still care and to build that relationship and finding those opportunities, I think, goes a long way. Just in the day-to-day, kind of the philosophy of you make the relationships before you need them, as well, as something that comes up a lot. Those of you, I'm interested, maybe some of our public health folks and or development district folks, Is there anything that you notice in different communities that you work in, where you've maybe had an easier go of it, and where maybe things have been more difficult? Is there anything that you notice in those communities, or anything that you've done? Maybe you learned a lesson in one community that you applied to another later down the road. Any lessons learned as far as what else helps make that work easier?
The work is just hard, Daniel. That's all we can say.
That's true. That's true. Great. Well, one of the last questions I had was, what attention and effort should Nebraskans commit to improving low confidence in national institutions? This is something that I've thought quite a bit about. We have higher confidence in our local institutions, which can be a conduit for getting things done, and that's great. But also, I think we can't ignore that trust in our national institutions that we all share together across the country is also important. I wonder if anybody else had any thoughts of how we can continue to hold those institutions accountable, while also, not leaving them for the vultures as well. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Do we have a responsibility to do that?
But I mean, I'll just offer some insight on something that I think I learned more during the last couple of election cycles, was how much local control there is in election systems. And so, the elections are highly decentralized to the local level. So it's interesting to me that if we trust our local county, but it's folks in other communities are doing something very similar and managing them, and there's local oversight. So it's like local oversight for me is good, but local oversight for others is not so good. And so that's a challenge, and I don't know if it helps to kind of talk through how the systems actually function to see if if there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance that kind of strikes someone as like that, okay, I see how that might not be consistent in my thinking, or if that helps at all. I have no idea, but that seems to strike me a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you, everybody. Please feel free to check out, you can check out the data for yourself, the rural and metro polls. The link is shown there, as well as our Civic Health Index, in which we highlight some of this information along with the other information and social connection, community engagement, political involvement. And then please, that first link there, fill out that evaluation. That'll give us an idea of how we did and what other future sessions and suggestions for improvement you have for us. But thank you everybody for coming today. Thanks for all the work you do across the state, and hope we can build a positive community to continue positive work and build hope in our communities.